African American life. What isn't commonly acknowledged is the role public housing has played in African American life, culture, and history since its inception in the 19th century. Statistics really are amazing on this point. In 2000, the African American population of the United States was about 14%, 15% if you want to be generous. African Americans, however, constituted almost 50% of the population of public housing throughout the United States. In cities such as Detroit, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, they constituted 100% of the public housing population. 100%. This should tell you something about America in the 20th century, that the two leading institutions that are influencers of black life that people repeatedly point to are the penitentiary, and we know the statistics there are very similar. African Americans now are about 13% of the population of the United States, but constitute what percentage of the prison population? A little less than that. About 60, somewhere between 50 and 60%. Most of them are in prison for drugs. Most of them are not in prison for violent crime. They are not in prison for manufacture or sale of drugs or narcotics. They are in prison for what? Possession. Right? Michelle Alexander makes this point very clear. She argues that the new Jim Crow is the reestablishment of a racial caste system in America that bears striking resemblance to the Jim Crow era of American life. And I can't believe my phone all of a sudden rings after I'd shut it off, which is just astonishing. Or at least it's James Brown, so it's all right. So, as I told you that to this history, I want to show you some things about Austin, Texas, on this score, on this issue, and Rosewood Courts, which is America's oldest black public housing project, as you can see, said. Because Austin now is entering a neoliberal phase in its development. The Austin Housing Authority is in the process of doing what cities like Atlanta and other cities that have terminated all of their public housing are doing. Neoliberalism is a philosophy that says what? That it's the market that has to be the leading force in the way we deal with the poor. And we now must introduce market forces into the management, the administration, the construction, and yes, the demolition of public housing. Austin, Texas is in many ways ground zero for public housing, mainly because of the legacy of our famous president, but at that time, Congressman Lyndon Baines Johnson. Okay? So HACA, the Housing Authority of the City of Austin, is in the middle right now of a reinvention. It's following the Atlanta model, which is the dominant model of how public housing agencies are going to be essentially deconstructed over the course of the 20th century. I do not have time, of course, to take you through all of this. You know, some people call it a lot of things. Some people call it the hegemony of the nonprofit, you know, this kind of thing, or, you know, the revolution will not be funded, these kinds of things. But I don't have time to take you through all of that, but hopefully this 15-minute slideshow will give you some idea of what's at stake here now in Austin, Texas, and some of the public policy questions that are on the table right now that require further debate and discussion. Because I can tell you this, just about nobody is questioning what the Housing Authority and its supporters have told you about what is happening in Rosewood. Most people have taken it for granted and have taken it at face value. Most of the stuff that has been declared by these people is at best debatable. At worst, it is outright false. I'm going to try to show you why that is. Okay, so let's talk about what Rosewood is. Rosewood is an 8.9 acre property in East Austin. It consists of 25 1- and 2-story housing structures and 4 storage buildings. And it's built primarily of brick and concrete, which is kind of unusual. Matter of fact, Rosewood in its construction, all three, by the way, of the original housing projects in Austin, Rosewood, Santa Rita, and Chalmers, were the first major residential structures in the history of Austin to be built to federally defined modernist standards using massive quantities of brick and concrete. There were no contractors in Austin, Texas at that time who had any experience working with these large volumes of brick and concrete for these kinds of structures. That's why the general contractor for Rosewood was imported from San Antonio. Okay? Concrete, of course, is a modern building material. It was used in ancient Rome, but over its history, concrete has been an elite construction material. Over the colonial history of the United States, most structures in the United States were made of what? Wood. Wood was plentiful. Concrete costs money. It's still very expensive, and it is now the world's leading building material. But it also has massive environmental impacts. The good thing about concrete is what? It tends to last. It lasts a very long time. Those Roman structures like the Forum, they still exist. Okay? People still use them today. Rosewood consists of 130 units. Not 124, 130. Okay? 60 units were first built in 1939, between 1938 and 1939. Construction of Santa Rita and Rosewood happened at the same time because they had the same contractor. But Rosewood was a much more challenging site to build on. It's on a pretty severe slope. It also had a lot of trees because it was Emancipation Park beforehand. There's also a creek that ran through the site. That slowed things down. Okay? But one of the nice things that LBJ, Congressman Johnson, was able to do is that during the construction of Rosewood, he was able to appeal to the USHA, the United States Housing Authority. The United States Housing Authority was created by the 1937 Housing Act, the so-called Wagner-Steagall Bill. You've heard of Glass-Steagall, right? It's that same Steagall guy. Who was Steagall? Anybody? Henry B. Steagall was a congressman from Alabama. And he was, of course, a Southern segregationist. And in order for him to get support for the passage of the 1937 Housing Act, President Roosevelt had to agree that the public housing that would be constructed under that law would be segregated. That's why in Austin, for instance, you had Santa Rita built for Mexicans, right? 40 units initially, right? Rosewood, 60 units for African Americans, and then Chalmers Courts built for whites, right? That's what explains that. It's significant historically. You can see this in the plaque. It's kind of dark. I don't have the right background, but you can see, and then there's a picture later I'll show you that explains it even further, about why it's historically significant. It's historically significant in terms of community planning, ethnic history, association with important historical figures, such as LBJ, Franklin Roosevelt, and others. And of course, it is a precursor of what later would become known as the international style, or the Art Moderne style in architecture. A communitarian philosophy of architecture whose design now has been incorporated, absorbed, like an amoeba into this thing people call new urbanism. This is the old urbanism, okay? None of it's new whatsoever. There's nothing new about it at all, okay? Stuff like co-ops and nonprofits, they were in the 1937 Housing Act. Everybody thinks it's wonderful now we have foundation communities. I love foundation communities, but it's not new. It's been around for a long time. The small town of Austin, Texas got this housing because of the unbelievable initiative of President Johnson, then Congressman Johnson. He was a 28-year-old, extremely ambitious young congressman who got elected to Congress in a special election. This is key. This is what got him elected. Those of you who have read Robert Carroll's books know about this, right? The Path to Power, that talks about how he got elected that first time. He was a young guy. He was a big Roosevelt New Dealer, right? Hitched himself to Roosevelt's wagon. He ran Roosevelt's National Youth Administration here in the state of Texas. He was also the chief of staff for a congressman from South Texas, LBJ was. He used and leveraged all of these things and got himself elected. But here's a key that's often overlooked. Because it was a special election, it was a direct federal election that bypassed the racist Democratic Party, Jim Crow system that existed in Texas at the time. That allowed LBJ then to directly court the African American vote, as well as the Mexican American vote. And there are many stories about how he did this. Okay? Basement meetings with preachers in the basement of Ebenezer Baptist Church, all kinds of different things. Remember, the leading minority element in Austin in the 1930s was the African American vote. It was not the Mexican-American vote. Mexican-Americans were still arriving in Austin in those years. Almost 20% of the population of Austin was black in those years. It's changed now, of course. Okay? And then, of course, portions of Rosewood were built on top of Emancipation Park. And I'll get into that in a minute. All of that makes it historical. Let's talk a little bit about some of the modernist architecture that goes into Rosewood and why it's a precursor to international style. Anybody know what this is? This is called Aluminum City Terrace. It's in Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh. And it's based on a movement that was going through Europe at the time, especially France, Germany, and England, called the modern housing movement. It was about social housing for the people. Remember, socialism was vibrant in these years, especially in Europe. Kind of a dirty word in the US, always has been, but not in Europe, right? Modernist housing was, in many ways, a rebellion against the Victorian, fluffy, stuff that had predominated before. This was an architecture for the people, okay? And this is in the National Register of Historic Places. A very important housing project designed by Walter Gropius and Ernst Money, Gropius was the founder of the Bauhaus. Anybody heard of the Bauhaus in Germany? Bauhaus was founded in 1919 in Weimar. It eventually moved, but eventually had to shut down when National Socialism came into the fore in Germany. And Gropius and others came into the United States and did stuff like this. Now notice its similarity to Roosevelt. There's a reason why they look similar. It's because they embody the same philosophy. Two of the biggest forces behind getting the international style or the modern housing movement enacted in the United States were a woman named Catherine Bauer. And by the way, this is a good book that talks to this. It's a book called Modern Housing in America, which talks, it's kind of almost a neo-biography of Bauer. She was a huge social housing reformer based in New York City. And her boyfriend, off and on, Louis Mumford. Anybody here a planner? If you are a city planner, you know who Louis Mumford was, okay? He was the leading architecture critic of the 20th century and a huge supporter of the international style and a big fan of Frank Lloyd Wright, who in many ways is the person, the single person who's responsible, even in Europe, for creating what we now know as modern architecture, okay? But I put these pictures up so you can see the tremendous influence this has. Now, one of the things that's interesting and ironic is that there was another person who came from Europe later who was immediately snapped up by all of the elite architecture and planning schools in the country. His name was Mies van der Rohe. Mies, you know Mies? Right? Another iconic architectural figure. He was famous for building houses out of glass, completely unfunctional. That represents a different trend in modernist architecture. It was no longer architecture for the people. It was modernist architecture for hipsters, yuppies, and rich people. Okay? Glass houses that look boxy. Okay? That's not the type of modernism that Rosewood and Aluminum City Terrace embody. Okay? Now let's talk a little bit about the Emancipation Park portion of Rosewood. These are the founders of Emancipation Park. Thomas White and his wife, Mrs. Thomas White. I say it up there like that because that's what the actual source material identifies her as. Maggie Hayward's wife, of course, has a street named for her at the Miller Development, the Robert Miller Development, right? She taught at the Blind, Deaf, and Orphan School in Austin for 40 years, a famous mixed-use artist in Austin, among other things. Most people know who she was, ironically, because Ruth Weingarten, a famous historian of black women in Texas, saw her out. Okay, but she didn't seek out Thomas White, who was her husband, who was the actual founder of the organization. Okay, you have to look at the black sources to get that information. Okay, but basically, they established Emancipation Park, which is one of the oldest Juneteenth parade grounds in America. This is important because Juneteenth is now an official holiday in most of the United States. There's people in Alaska who celebrate Juneteenth, which I find kind of interesting. Okay? There's no Juneteenth parade grounds that I know of in Alaska or Idaho or some of these other places. I'm very happy that they have these celebrations in these locations. So it's very important from a historical perspective that original Juneteenth parade grounds be recognized on the landscape. It's a Texas holiday. Okay? So now you can see some of the history there. It was founded, by the way, on June 8, 1904. The Travis County Emancipation Organization, sometimes called the Travis County Emancipation League, okay? And the land for Emancipation Park was purchased in 1907. There were Juneteenth celebrations prior to that. Remember, around the turn of the last century, African Americans were largely dispersed throughout Boston, all right? Masonville, Clarksville, places near where I live now currently called Burdett's Prairie, okay? Things started to centralize in the early 20th century. It especially started to centralize when the descendants of former Governor EMPs created neighborhoods like the Enfield neighborhood and Pemberton Heights, and then of course Hyde Park. All of those neighborhoods